Well, today our series in 1 Timothy brings us to chapter 3. I think I mentioned in the first week of the series that chapter 3, verses 14 and 15, summarize Paul's reason for writing to Timothy. Paul writes that if he's delayed from coming to Ephesus himself, he wants to encourage and remind Timothy, quote, how people ought to conduct themselves in God's household. And so he's writing Timothy in large part to advise him on how to respond to false teachers that are influencing the church. And as opposed to the way that the false teachers are conducting themselves, Paul explains to Timothy in this letter how Christians ought to really conduct themselves in God's household, how Christians ought to conduct themselves within the local church. And so as we've been doing throughout the series, we're going to go straight to the text. 1 Timothy 3, 1 through 16. I think it'll be on the screen. And we will, again this week, read it together. So are you ready? Let's go. Here is a trustworthy saying. Whoever aspires to be an overseer desires a noble task. Now the overseer is to be above reproach, faithful to his wife, temperate, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not given to drunkenness, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own family well and see that his children obey him, and he must do so in a manner worthy of full respect. If anyone does not know how to manage his own family, how can he take care of God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may become conceited and fall under the same judgment as the devil. He must also have a good reputation with outsiders, so that he will not fall into disgrace and into the devil's trap. In the same way, deacons are to be worthy of respect, sincere, not indulging in much wine, and not pursuing dishonest gain. They must keep hold of the deep truths of the faith with a clear conscience. They must first be tested, and then if there is nothing against them, let them serve as deacons. In the same way, the women are to be worthy of respect, not malicious talkers, but temperate and trustworthy in everything. A deacon must be faithful to his wife and must manage his children and his household well. Those who have served well gain an excellent standing and great assurance in their faith in Christ Jesus. Although I hope to come to you soon, I am writing you these instructions so that, if I am delayed, you will know how people ought to conduct themselves in God's household, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and foundation of the truth. Beyond all question, the mystery from which true godliness springs is great. He appeared in the flesh, was vindicated by the Spirit, was seen by angels, was preached among the nations, was believed on in the world, was taken up in glory. Amen to the word of God. So within these verses, Paul informs Timothy, and by extension us, of some expectations that exist for local churches and leaders of local churches. He shares some things that are expected of the church relating to how the church is to be governed, some things that are expected of church leaders themselves, and some things that are expected of the entire church together. And so I want to just highlight a few important points in each of these areas: church government, church organization, church government, church leaders, and the entire church. So first, let's look at some of the key things we can take from this passage related to church government. Of course, there's a lot that can be said about this topic, both from this passage and others. I just have a few key things to highlight for today. The first one is this. It's to note that Paul makes it very clear that a local church should have a multiplicity of leaders. It should be led, it should be governed by a team of leaders. Within the text that we read today, we see arguably four leadership roles that Paul highlights. Paul mentions first the role of elder, bishop, overseer. I'll say more about that in a minute, but for our purposes right at this moment, that's one role, elder, bishop, overseer. He also mentions the role of deacons. And then, depending on the translation you're reading from, he articulates responsibilities for women in the church, which could either mean the wives of the deacons or it could mean deaconesses, women deacons. And so we see within the text at least three roles. And if we consider that Paul is writing to Timothy, who it's pretty clear had a unique leadership role within this church at Ephesus, then we likely see four roles within this text. Many believe that Timothy was serving in Ephesus as a special envoy of Paul, and so likely we see four roles that are highlighted here, which I think highlights the key point we find on church organization, church government here in 1 Timothy. Churches are to have a multiplicity of leaders. The structure at Ephesus seems to be that Timothy served in this sort of a unique leadership role among the elders of the church. Maybe you could say a leader of the elders. The elders or the overseers, bishops, had the responsibility for overall leadership of the church. And then the deacons and deaconesses served in support roles to elders to carry out the ministry of the local church. And so the most important point, I think, from this text about church government is that it requires a multiplicity of leaders. But I think it's worth pointing out, since we're on this topic, that I think it's important for us to realize there is not a single pattern of church government that's set forth in the New Testament as being prescriptive for all churches at all times, at all places. And I say this because sometimes Christians get really critical of the way that various churches and denominations are organized and governed, because you may have noticed, and if you've been a part of different churches and different denominations, you may have noticed that they often have very different governing structures. But I think before we get too critical of those things, we need to accept that the New Testament does not give us a prescriptive form of government for all times and all places, which is why churches and denominations have come to such varying forms of governing structure. Even the range of Christian understanding of this chapter makes this point, that there's not one prescriptive way of doing this. The word that's translated overseer here in the Greek is the word episkopos. And depending on the translation, it either gets translated as overseer, elder, or bishop. When you go over to the book of Titus, there's a very similar list of qualifications for leaders. And in the Greek, the word presbyteros is the word that is used. And everywhere I know of, that word is translated as elder. Here's the point of this. Many believe that elder and overseer and bishop describe the same role. But some believe there's a distinction in the way these terms get used. And we know that there's been a distinction in the way these terms have been used in the church over the past 2,000 years. And so there have been a diversity of views as to exactly what an elder is, what a bishop is, what an overseer is. Elders are often viewed as local church leaders, while in some traditions, bishops are those who lead elders, or in many church traditions, bishops are those who oversee several local churches. And so my point in sharing this is not to be tedious or annoying. My point in sharing this is simply to say that people have looked at the text, they have looked at the New Testament, they have said, how do we organize the church? What do these terms mean? And they have come to some different conclusions. But what we can say with confidence about church government is that a church is to be organized with a multiplicity of leaders. We don't want to be overly dogmatic about exactly what that looks like, and we certainly don't want to be overly uptight about the exact terms that are used, but there should be a multiplicity of leaders. And what we see here within 1 Timothy is, I think, a good basic framework for local church governance, which is elders and overseers that lead the church, supported by other local church leaders called deacons and deaconesses. Now, one of the reasons that I don't think we should be overly dogmatic about having to use the exact terminology that Paul did is because at the time of his writing, these terms were not exclusive to the church. Okay? In Greece and Rome and Jewish traditions, for example, elder was a widely recognized role in a variety of religious traditions. And in some cases, the words that are used in Paul's writing to describe different leadership roles were even used in secular settings. And so here's the point. These weren't necessarily holy titles. They were functional titles. Okay? So many churches do use elders and deacons. Others use pastors for the role that the New Testament would call elder. Some churches use the term elder, but they don't use the term deacon. Instead, they simply call people in the role of deacon ministry leaders. That's what we do here. Other churches don't try to use biblical terms at all, and instead they've adopted language that's similar to what you'd see in business. Some churches call their elders their senior leadership team or their senior management team. And they call their deacons their program directors or coordinators. I heard of one church that called their elders the architects, and I thought that was ridiculous. But because I don't believe exact terminology is so important, I thought it was ridiculous within my own mind until today when I told you about it. But what's important is that a church is to have leaders, plural. And there should be overseeing leaders, such as elders, and there should be support leaders, such as deacons, whatever terminology is used. Churches are to have a range of leadership positions active in the church, not just one or two people who lead everything. Here at Living Hope Church, we use the term elders for elders, but then for no other reason than it's just what we chose to do, we don't use the term deacons, we use the term ministry leaders. But even that has some variation. Such as with me. I'm an elder in our church, but most of you call me pastor, which is probably best understood as the lead elder of the church. But again, that's not what we call me. We call me pastor. And pastor is a term that's often applied to leaders in the church today that would most likely be called elder or overseer in the language of the New Testament. Again, the point of all this is not to get hung up on the titles, the terminology. The point of all of this, the church is to have a variety of overseeing and support leaders that work together in unity. It's not to be about one or two people doing all the leading. If your eyes haven't glazed over yet, let me touch on one or two more things about church government, and then we'll move on. I want you to notice in the writing about the organization of leadership within the church, Paul mentioned elders, deacons, and then depending on which translation you read, he either mentions the women or their wives. And this is another of those debatable passages as it relates to this topic of women and their roles in the church. Some believe that Paul is giving instructions regarding the wives of deacons, and others believe that Paul is giving instructions regarding women deacons. You are absolutely welcome to your own view. But our guiding position here at Living Hope Church is that Paul is giving qualifications for women deacons, which means we believe that church leadership, church government is to include both men and women leaders. Now, last week I went to great length to talk about this topic, to explain why we embrace women leading and even teaching here at Living Hope Church. So I'm not going to rehash that again here today, but that's how we view this particular passage. And as we see today, these roles of elder and then of deacons and deaconesses, I do want to mention at this point that here at Living Hope Church, we do view the role of elder as being a leadership position that is reserved for male leadership. And neither of these positions, the inclusion of women in leadership or that eldership is for male leadership, neither of these things should be a surprise to anyone who has been here for a while. But if you have any questions about that or why we've taken these positions, I'd invite you to email me this week, or we can get together over coffee. I'll be happy to dialogue about it. It just goes beyond my purposes today to go much further into that. I'm actually bored out of my mind already myself, so I can imagine how you feel. So we affirm women leading, including leading men. We affirm women to teach and even to preach. At the same time, our conviction here is that the role of elder is to be filled by male leaders. And this is a view that frustrates fully committed complementarians as well as fully committed egalitarians alike, which is not our goal, but we're willing to accept and live with. So our view here at Living Hope Church is summarized really well by the late Timothy Keller. Keller said that when it comes to women leading in the church, quote, women can do anything a non-elder male can do, which means that women can fill pretty much any leadership role except for those that are specifically for elders, which largely amounts to exercising church discipline and providing the senior leadership of the church. So again, if you have any questions, email me. I'll be happy to dialogue with you. But experience has taught me there are usually only a few people within our church family who are kind of fully committed one way or the other. So I'm not going to take more time for this today. It's in the Bible, though, so it's a valid thing to discuss and dialogue about. So if it's something that you'd like to do that, please let me know. Let's turn our attention to what's expected of local church leaders. And here's the first thing that our text makes very clear, is that church leaders are to be people of good character. Consider the character qualities that Paul says are required of elders. He says they are to be above reproach, they're to be faithful to their wife, temperate, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, not a drunkard, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money, must manage his own household well, obedient children, not to be a recent convert, well thought of by outsiders. All character issues, character qualities. And within this huge list of character concerns, there's one job-related competency that's tucked in there, able to teach. But the great concern is with character. So the character of church leaders matters a great deal. And then we see character qualities that Paul lists for deacons: worthy of respect, sincere, not addicted to much wine, not greedy for dishonest gain, holding the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience. And what many think that means is just that they're people who are fully persuaded of the truth of the gospel. They're not people who are kind of filled with doubt and wavering and wishy-washy, but they're fully persuaded of the truth of the gospel. They must be tested and only serve once testing shows nothing against them. Faithful to his wife, manage children and household well. And then qualifications for women or wives or deaconesses, however you view it: worthy of respect, not malicious talkers, temperate and trustworthy in all things. And with these list of qualifications, we have to again keep in context what's happening here in 1 Timothy, that Paul is responding, he's writing in response to the false teachers. He has the false teachers in mind. And each of these lists stand in contrast to what was true of the false teachers. They were people with poor character. And Paul's saying, that's not what we want. We need people who are influencing the church who have good character. And rather than parse these individual qualifications, I simply want to highlight two important things that these qualifications communicate to us about local church leaders. And here's the first one. Church leaders are accountable for their actions, and church leaders are accountable for their character. Those who enter into any level of leadership within the church, okay? So this applies to me, it applies to our elders, but this isn't just like, hey, you and the elders need to shape up and make sure your character is good. It applies to everybody in any level of leadership in a church. Character matters. Those who enter any level of leadership within the church must fully accept that accountability for their character comes with the role. Now, there's something that's often said about leaders that I think is well-intentioned but not exactly right. It's often said that leaders are held to a higher standard. And I understand what people are saying when they say, I don't think it's quite right. Here's why I don't think so. Which of the character qualifications for elders or deacons are not expectations for all Christians? Is there anything in those lists that we looked at that isn't an expectation of every Christian? The answer is no. Every Christian is expected to live with the kind of character that is in those lists. All Christians are responsible to live lives of good character. And so I think what we mean when we say leaders are held to a higher standard isn't so much that they're actually held to a higher standard, but that they are held accountable to the standard expected of all Christians. There isn't so much a higher standard, but there is greater accountability for the standard. Leadership comes with real responsibility. And because it does, it must also come with real accountability. Remember again, Paul's writing to encourage Timothy towards setting things in order in the church at Ephesus. Some people who weren't doing what they were supposed to do, weren't living like they were supposed to live, were having influence in the church, and they needed to be held accountable. And so let me just talk for a couple of minutes to leaders here at Living Hope Church. Anyone who has a leadership role at any level here at Living Hope Church, when you accepted that role, you accepted the accountability that comes with it. You accepted real responsibility, and so you accepted real accountability. All of us who lead in any capacity at Living Hope Church, we must be people of good character. Character that is pleasing to God. And so we need to be constantly examining ourselves and saying, does my character match what God expects of me? Does my character match what God expects of me? Does my character match what my church family expects of me? Does my character match the qualifications of the role that I am serving in? And so we have to own this truth that leaders are people of good character. And we also have to own this next thing. We're not just accountable for our character, we're accountable to fulfill our responsibilities. We're accountable for handling conflict in a way that pleases God. Leaders, we're accountable. And here's what this means. It means that sometimes if there's a valid concern, either about a matter of character or a matter of responsibilities, being accountable means there could be a situation where another leader has to hold someone accountable. You're leading within a ministry, but the person who oversees that ministry might need to hold you accountable. All of us need to ask God to work in our hearts to make us receptive to godly accountability. Because we don't like that, do we? We don't like being asked the gentlest of questions. But we really do need to be open to godly accountability. Leaders should be people of good character. Leaders should be people who embrace accountability. And the final thing we see in the text about leaders are to represent the church well within the larger community, meaning outside of these four walls, within the larger community. The false teachers, through their public behavior, were bringing the gospel into disrepute. Leaders must represent the church and Christ well within the larger community. And so here's a question for all of us, and this is for every Christian, especially for us that are leaders, but this is for every Christian. Is who we show ourselves to be here in church, who we also show ourselves to be out there in the rest of the world, outside of these four walls. Let me just give a few practical examples of ways that we need to make sure that we're representing the church and Christ well in the larger community. Most of you who have been here for a while, you know me well enough to know that I don't think being a Christian means that you have to always be a doormat, that you have to always roll over when you're mistreated, that you have to always accept lousy customer service or just, always take it when you're treated wrong. But we do have a responsibility to conduct ourselves in ways that are pleasing to God. Do we watch how we interact with everyone because we care about representing Christ and the church well? Do we watch that? Are we vigilant about that? And here are some real practical things. Leader, are you a good tipper? This is a way that you represent Christ and the church in the larger community. Are you a good tipper? Leader, how do you ask your server for more of something? Is it refill? Or is it, when you have time, could I get a refill, please? Is it more chips? Or is it, and salsa, or is it, hey, when you get a minute, could I get some more chips? Leader, how do you conduct yourself in terms of your business in the community? Are you known to be fair with people? Do you keep your word? If you volunteer for a community organization, do you do what you say you will do? How we represent ourselves in public really matters. Let me tell you one of the reasons that I go to the good tipper and the more chips example so quickly. When I was a young man of 16, I worked in a restaurant. And this restaurant was close to a well-known church in the community. And we hated it when that church service was over and their members came into our restaurant. We hated it. I was a Christian of a similar variety to the church in question, and I still hated it when they would come into our restaurant. They would move tables around without asking. They would stop you in the middle of serving your multiple tables to pray with you if they thought you were having a bad day. And one of the poor young servers came back behind the counter and she said, I can't believe it. That guy just stopped me and prayed with me that I would have a better day. And she said, it's a nice thought. But can't he see how busy I am? I don't have time for him to pray for me right now. This was a church that leaned a little bit toward a prosperity gospel message, and so they would occasionally, you'd hear things like this: young man, see this jacket I'm wearing here? $500 jacket, gift from the king. All right. So it's important that we represent ourselves well in the larger community, and that was not doing it. And so I think about representing ourselves in restaurants quite a bit, because that's my experience. And again, I was sort of, without the prosperity gospel part, like generally I was kind of aligned with what this church was like, but it was so off-putting to me. It was just awful. It was just awful. And so we don't want to do that. We need to be mindful of how we conduct ourselves to the outside world. Church leaders are to be people of good character, people who embrace accountability, and people who represent the church well, both within the church and outside the church. So leaders, let's examine ourselves, make sure we're doing what we should do, make sure we're exhibiting that good character, make sure we're open to accountability, and make sure that we're honoring Christ in our public conduct. And of course, I don't know everything there is to know about anybody who leads within this church. But based on everything I know, here's what I can say with a high level of confidence. I believe Living Hope Church is filled with leaders who are doing these things. And I am very thankful that that is the case. Now let's see what we find about what's expected of the entire church, the whole body of believers that make up a local church. Verse 15 tells us what it is, but I'm going to start at verse 14. Here's what we read in 14 and 15. Although I hope to come to you soon, I am writing these things to you so that if I am delayed, you will know how people ought to conduct themselves in God's household, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and the foundation of the truth. There are a few things in this verse 15 especially that give us hints of things that are expected of us together as a church, all of us together. And the first one is that it's expected of us that we see ourselves and that we live as a family. We're told that we are part of God's household. We're part of God's family. And I think the important thing in thinking of the church as a family is the commitment that we are to have to each other and to the community as a whole. We are not to just be ships passing in the night. These people are okay to hang out with for a little while until I find something better. We are to be fully committed to each other. Are you fully committed to your brothers and sisters here? Whatever your level of friendship, do you see people in this church as people who could call you and you would help them to the best of your ability? Are you willing to value people here enough that you'll work through difficulty with them instead of bailing out when the relationship becomes difficult? And I understand there are always limitations, okay? There are always limitations. But generally speaking, are you willing to value people enough to work through difficulty instead of bailing out when things get difficult? Are you willing to tolerate and love the crazy uncles and aunts of the church? You know, most families have a crazy uncle or a crazy aunt somewhere. And, you know, the crazy uncle or aunt is different for different people. You might be the crazy uncle or the crazy aunt for someone. But will you love the person who is that for you? What's expected of all of us is to view ourselves and conduct ourselves as family. As family. to be committed to each other. Secondly, we're to live like who we are, the church of the living God. We're the ecclesia, the called out ones. The church is made up of those who have been called by God and responded to that call. We are the people who have been called out from the darkness of this present world and called into the light of God's kingdom. Will we live like that? Or will we continue living like we've never responded to God's call? And then we find two things that it means to be the household of God, the church of the living God. It means that we are to be the pillar and the foundation of the truth. In the city of Ephesus, the temple of Artemis or Diana was surrounded by 127 pillars, each a gift from a different king. They were made of marble, they were studded with jewels and overlaid with gold. And they were not support pillars. They were pillars that were meant to draw attention to the temple. And it's probably not a coincidence that Paul uses this term, pillars of the truth. We are to be pillars of the truth. We are to be people who draw attention to the truth. We're to be people who display the truth to all people. We're to be committed individually and collectively to drawing the attention of those around us to the truth, the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. This is our responsibility, all of us together, draw attention to Jesus. And then we find that the church is also the foundation of the truth. We are to be those who uphold the truth when others seek to tear it down, when others seek to destroy it. The false teachers were seeking to compromise and destroy the truth. Timothy, but not only Timothy, but the entire church community had a responsibility to guard the truth, support the truth, uphold the truth in the face of opposition. The church of Jesus Christ is always called to defend the truth, even when doing so is unpopular, even when doing so means confronting false teachers, even when doing so means coming into conflict with those you've welcomed into your community. Many Christians today have no stomach for defending truth, but according to Paul, it's expected of local churches that they would act in defense of the truth. And then verse 16 is part of a hymn that lays out some of the truth of the life of Jesus that the church is meant to draw attention to be a pillar and a foundation for. Jesus appeared in the flesh, was vindicated by the Spirit, was seen by angels, believed on in the world, and was taken up into glory. And of course, we could add to all of that, and is coming again. So 3 areas of expectations on the church that we see in our text today. We're expected to have a multiplicity of leaders within the church. Leadership is to be shared. Leaders are to be people of good character and accountable for their character, represent the church well in the outside community. And the entire church is to live as a family, live as called out people, display the truth, and defend the truth against those who would seek to destroy it. Friends, these are really amazing responsibilities that we have. They are privileged responsibilities. If you think about being entrusted by God to be a pillar and foundation of truth, it's really a great privilege. An expectation, an obligation, but a privilege. And it's something that we should joyfully and thankfully embrace and give our lives to. And so my prayer today is that all of this that we've seen in 1 Timothy 3 would be true of Living Hope Church. I think to a large extent it is, and I'm thankful for that. Why don't you stand?